This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. Last week, I was talking about connectivity with trails and with rails. Rather confusing, especially if you don't have visual material to go with the radio program. We'd like to see connections between Danville, Champaign-Urbana, Monticello, Decatur, Clinton, Bloomington, and there are other possibilities too. This is in the early stages of rail trail development. It's not so at the national level. The National level of Rail Trail Conservancy started probably about 30 years ago. Some members of Congress were getting upset that the Rail Banking Act, or the Steigers Act, that had allowed obsolete railroad beds to be abandoned and consumed. Consumed meaning taken over by a real estate. They were worried that there was too much abandonment. The most popular abandonments were small railroad yards that were about 5 miles apart with an elevator, and that was the community. Sometimes the community was a little far from the railroad bed, but mostly when the railroad went in, the community moved from where they were to the railroad bed, and that became the community. The early settlements might have been on a river or on a moraine that was higher. So there was movement in the settlement patterns. The Congress knew about this, and they were aware that if they got rid of all their railroad beds, especially those that were connecting town to town and more substantial than small elevated grain lines, that to get them back, to get a corridor back, if manufacturing went in one place and had to connect with a main line elsewhere, it would cost a lot. It would cost, firstly, there would be a mountain of opposition, because by this time, everyone's bought their own plot of land and a railroad's going to go through it. No way. But it also would be very costly to buy real estate back. So the Congress worked out a Rail Banking Act, and that Rail Banking Act gave money to potential trailers and bicycle trails and hikers and biologists who wanted to save the vegetation on either side of the ballast, gave them an opportunity to do that, and they would be paid for the interim use of the railroad bed. Heartland Pathways was also aware of this, like the people who were observed buying railroad beds for trails and biology. We were doing both those things before there was a Rail Banking Act. But we knew about Rail Bank Acts, and when Conrail decided to abandon between Danville and Urbana, we proselytized the community for those organizations that were mature and in active reality to take out an interim trail use agreement with the federal government Surface Transportation Board. No one would be willing to do that. What they had to do to meet the requirements of the act was they had to buy the railroad bed at a reasonable price, probably negotiated by assessments, taking real estate value, farm value, or whatever nearby to see what the cost was. Not outrageous by any means. We got to that stage and did a lot of the hack work, which was necessary. First of all, you had to know about 10 years ahead of time that this was a corridor that was interesting. It had Kickapoo State Park at one end and a banner at the other. And it had research ponds and the like that were interesting to biologists. Early ponds created by strip mining might have been 75 years old and have biodiversity. And more recent ones would have fewer organisms and lots of them. And this was a good situation for students, especially to get a realization of how regrowth succession works with plants and with animals. We had in the same time frame bought 6 acres of a borrow pit or a gravel pit on a moraine, the Bloomington Moraine north of Rantoul, and it was having some of the same situations where you could restore biodiversity over 70, 80, 100, 150 years from surrounding remnants. So we had done our homework to know what was there. That's important. You need to know that in this case, there was an advantage of knowing that the department, the Surface Transportation Board and the Rail Banking Act would make sure that the titles and deeds of the railroad bed remained intact. That is, the rail banking preservation would preserve the corridor as one more public use. We in Monticello area had bought 33 miles before there was a Rail Banking Act, and there you have to be concerned about deeds. Sometimes a warranty deed that the railroad owned it. Easement, the railroad didn't own it, it had permission to go across it for a certain time. And then there were adverse possessions where the railroad just went by and took over 15 feet and didn't say anything too much to anyone. And so the easements and the adverse possessions can go back to the original owners. If you have an intact purchase, it's likely that that may not happen, but we were faced with that. The Danville to Urbana site, the deeds were quieted, no return to farmland or business on that corridor. And as I said, the existing conservation agencies were not willing to buy the land. It was a little bit of a risk that this mightn't happen, but we were prepared to do it. So we took out an interim trail use agreement with the federal government. Then when we'd done that, when we'd done the hack work, a number of groups gradually began realized that this was an interesting thing to do. Not only did they not know the corridor, but they didn't know its educational value, its biological value, and that took about 10 years of steady work beforehand, and we didn't really anticipate that the Conrail would retire, but we'd have been observing the area. And let me digress for a moment. Champaign-Urbana is in a very flat community, and it has to depend on Vermilion County with some rolling territory and coal and Vermilion River. It has to depend on Clinton Power Plant Lake and the possibility of yachts and boats and fishing, and there has to be a Monticello and an Allerton Park and a Lodge Park and Shady Rest, and so Champaign-Urbana takes a lot of interest in having a weekend or some territory in those counties around us. Piatt County, Macon County, Vermilion County, and also south to Douglas County and even to Moultrie County. So you're looking at a Champaign-Urbana that's somewhat starved of its own territory. We have, if you're subtle, you can notice that there is a Yankee Ridge. If you're in Piatt County, you can notice that there's a Cerro Gordo moraine. I just visited someone who owns territory on the river there, and there's a cliff, and they wondered how in this flatland you ever had a cliff. Well, the cliff was part of the Cerro Gordo moraine, and the river broke through it. I have other friends that have flatland there, and it's bottomland, and you get bluebills in the spring, and it's wonderful, but it is a sort of territory where the Sangamon River will flood. If you go south to Coles County, near to Charleston, there's a Charleston Lake, and there's territories that the Grand Prairie Friends are working with called Warbler Woods. And I was there on Saturday, and it was a wonderful experience. The trees are relatively mature. This is not a cut over territory. The ravines were natural. They went into the Ombra, which is another of the rivers that drain the Champaign-Urbana area. But when they get further down, they get to be interesting. And what the Grand Prairie Friends has been doing is buying or been giving or getting grant money to establish areas around state-owned areas so that the complex in total in the vicinity of Charleston Reservoir, a lake that provides water for the Charleston region. It's a very good site, an interesting site, and it's a place where Champaign people visit and enjoy. And we did go a little further to Arcola, where there was a potential rail trail there, but there was also prairie on that rail trail, and we spent a lot of time preserving that. It went to the Department of Conservation, and recently it was, as a result of a lot of lobbying, that was turned back to farmers for a few more rows of corn and soybeans. So we look at these sites for a long time. It just didn't happen yesterday. We work within the framework of the University of Illinois using contingency money, which is money that's given to departments and colleges to provide for research facilities and to augment the research and teaching opportunities of the university. When those funds dried up, we moved to a local situation in Champaign, but we had been working with these corridors for years, and it was appropriate to go to the community. We knew what we were doing when we bought, or we took out an interim trade use agreement, and were pleased when we did, and we're about to raise the funds to buy the line. I'm not quite sure why the federal government wanted people to buy the line when it was going to interim trail use, but I think it is because they wanted to see that the people who bought the line had a commitment. Often this is a characteristic of grants where a shared situation exists, mainly because the federal government or state government and local government are wanting to make sure that the people who are going to get involved with this are serious and are going to stay with it. Well, we had groups that emerged out of the woodwork. They wouldn't do it in the first place, but they got to be interested. One in particular was the Champaign County Design and Conservation Foundation, CCDC. And they were pleased to note that this was a healthy idea. They were a trust, and they felt that they could get the money to buy the railroad line and meet federal dictates. So we included them as partners in the Federal Rail Banking Act. So we not only had the railroad, Conrail, the federal government, Surface Transportation Board, and Heartland Pathways involved. We added the CCDC, and CCDC then wanted to take over, and we sort of gulped a little bit, but said, well, okay, if you want to do that, that's okay, as long as it happens. There were some problems here that we were interested in a governmental body, which is often called an authority. And the authority can have, say, 4, 7, or 9 people. And often that authority includes people who are the royal opposition. In this case, the royal opposition is the community that would like to buy the railroad bed back for agriculture. After 6 generations of removing prairie, prairie gets to have the status of a weed, and if it sits around for too long, it'll be regarded as a weed patch and worthy of being dug up for agriculture. So it is good to have people on an authority to have several different ideas about what should happen to this sort of railroad. You have to imagine the Steigers Act was in the early 80s, and railroad beds were being closed out around the country. Behind it, there was the fact that there were people who were supportive of the rail trail interest. They formed the Rail to Trail Conservancy, and it now has thousands of participants, members, and probably about, they don't control all the railroad beds that we speak about, but they at least have something like 30,000, I think, miles of rail bed that have been converted to trails. It's a lot of and they have engineers, and they have educational people, and it's a big organization, and they lobby to the federal government to keep this going. And the rail trail movement has had a lot of responsibility for working with Congress to restore rail beds and also subsidiary areas to trails. They've even got to the point of trying to go across the country with rail trails. And that's their latest movement. We do already have trails that are on roads that sometimes include rail beds that go across the country. There are levels that go across on Route 80 high in the country and also low. I think Route 90, it's a much more weather oriented corridor. The Route 80 gets to be cold. So there are trails across the country that aren't necessarily rail trails, but the principle is the same. The enjoyment is a little different. The people who are interested in rail trails get used to the fact that the bed is often chipped limestone, which is add some calcium to it, and it becomes a all-weather trail. But it's not something that you can run a half-inch size speed bike on. You have to have an all-terrain bicycle, and so people who are doing this often have several different bicycles to do different things. They're geared differently, have different tires, and so the rail trail movement knows about this, and they make sure that the federal government knows about this, and it fortunately is a favorite topic for both parties. This is not a conflictual thing. It may be a financial thing, but many communities have benefited from these rail trail conversions. It brings people together. It used to be in your little town with your horses and whatnot and the railroad. You had basically people who looked after the railroad and looked after the elevator. So 60% of the town was those two organizations. The farming community often would retreat to the rail trail center and have a home in, older people would have a home in the small town, and younger people would be out there with a farmhouse. But the communities were separate. But once you put in you take out the railroad bed and you allow the young folk, especially, to ride a bicycle 5 miles to the next little town, that gets to be a camaraderie and also an economic benefit. And that's part of the wonder of the rail trail organization. So back to Danville to Champaign. You have a corridor that's basically flat to Oakwood. By the time you get to Oakwood, if you're coming from Urbana and going to Danville, you're getting into territory that has a little rambunctious, it has been subject to deep mining and also followed by strip mining. It could still be mined. There's an attempt to put a new mine in the southwest corner of Champaign County, southeast corner of Champaign County, southwest corner of Vermilion County. And there's been lots of debate about that. The little Vermilion River, which is an offshore of the big Vermilion River, is not a very big supplier of water. So the potential mine has been proselytizing the communities around because they need to wash the coal. And then the dregs, what do you do with the dregs? Well, they sometimes sit and get into clean water creeks. And that's another problem in the Danville area. But if you think about it, you could also take that water and just put it down a mine shaft, and it pollutes the underground aquifers from which we drink. There are lots of debate in this area. And I'm obviously confusing you some, but that's the whole purpose, because we want you to think about these things. And there are lots of alternatives. And we hope that you will be involved in knowing where the sites are, knowing where the interests are, and putting your ore in the water and stirring the witch's brew here. There are a number of people who spend a large percentage of their lives doing this. Sue Smith in Homer has done a lot of work to encourage people to think about new mines and to think about the clean area rivers that are part of the middle fork of the Vermilion that people like to visit. But there in the middle of it was a coal mine, a coal industry, electrical generating plant, and the tailings were put into ponds that are now leaching into a clean stream. And there's been a legal battle to make sure that those tailings are not going to stay leaching into the river. They have to be buried at a higher level, or something has to happen to them. And the state has now passed a law that says that they have to be concerned about that. So if you're talking about Danville, it's not straightforward. There's some nice bridges and valleys that go into the Middle Fork and the North Fork, and then into the Wabash and into the Ohio and Mississippi and down into the Gulf. So excess nitrogen and phosphate coming off of the farmland around goes down the same corridor. If you add herbicides and pesticides and a few other ingredients coming off of urban places that have pollutants in them, means that the river is not as pure as it used to be. So we want you to be out there looking at those sites. It means that you probably could follow the Natural Areas Study Group, Audubon, plant preservation communities. Isaac Walton League has died, but there have been many attempts to bring some common sense to this area, and often it's by people who don't necessarily own the adjacent land. The CCTC wanted to take over because they were a trust and that was convenient. But there's the balance that you have to look at between an authority with 5, 7, or 9 members that includes the royal opposition. That would be creating a new organization. It was felt that the Urbana Park District and Forest Preserve and other agencies had been around for a long time, and it was better to go with an established organization. That's okay. If that's how you do it, that's okay. I was a little disappointed that we didn't have a lot of different involvement in the process. But the money needed for the purchase of the line was not obtained. So the corridor sat for 20 years, but it's recently been established again. So at the Danville end, you have what was a reasonably mainline corridor converted from a mainline connection to a trail. That means that if in 100 years' time you have some sort of factory in Danville that wants to have a connection to the Canadian National in Champaign, the bed could be resurrected. There would be lots of opposition, as you could anticipate, but if the development were powerful enough and commercial enough, then the rail bed would be converted. So the ballast and the bridges are intact and can come back to rail if necessary. In the vicinity of Danville, you have a history of coal. There are faults underneath that allowed the accumulation of carboniferous organisms to be compressed, as in peat, and compressed even more so that you created coal. So last week I dealt some with Monticello area, and so I'm wanting to concentrate today on the area between Urbana and Danville. I was aware that the Natural Area Study Group that we initiated many, many years ago as a docent group, brought into action by Anne Firehome, who was the powerhouse, then got people together, and 30 odd years later, the Natural Area Study Group is still working at being unofficial docents. They will gather up information about a natural area and find out about it, perhaps go back, visit again, but establish enough information and enough enthusiasm to take this information to other groups. Established groups, schools, parks, what have you. They also encounter people who go to these areas because they have interesting geology, interesting biology. And so some people, especially people from Natural History Survey, will have weekend houses or plots of land in Vermilion County. There are also early history there. At some places, the limestone comes out to the point that you can have a water mill, a race, which takes on a shortcut between a meander where the water is higher, and then it can be converted to a water mill, to grind grain or to store timber, lumber. So I got smart and knew that the Natural Area Study Group was going to go to Vermilion County for a field trip. And I thought, well, they have the choice of going by 74 and they have the choice of letting themselves know about the corridor that runs parallel, the old Highway 150. I was aware that they had a shortage of time. They meet at 9 o'clock and usually try to be, they finish up with a meal, perhaps 1 o'clock. So time was precious. So if they were going to travel by 150, they had to have a windshield only corridor. So I sat there and pounded out a little bit of the history of this corridor. It was broken into two parts. The Grand Prairie Friends, the Natural Area Study Group, starts at Broadway and comes down Broadway. Well, then you have to think about how we get this part of the Kickapoo Trail connected to Champaign without you being killed. It's not easy. There are several suggestions. You can go through from the MTD building, more or less, not in downtown Champaign, but their bus terminal, up and around the north end of Champaign and on streets and alleyways that would allow for connectivity, but it's sort of rambunctious and pictorial, and it's okay if you're on a vacation and you want to take a ride around the woods, but it's not a direct connection. It's not something that people who are using St. Joe as a bedroom community can come straight through to Urbana and find a way through to Champaign. So I wanted to break this field guide into two parts. The first part was, what do you do with the connection between Urbana and Champaign and further to Whiteheath and Monticello and Decatur? It raises all sorts of conundrums. I think I'm going to leave that one for the moment, and I'm going to go back to the trail guide that would start at 150 as it comes off University Avenue. So you come out Broadway and you're going to go past an MTD garage and offices. They actually occupy what used to be an area that was where engines would be stored and repaired and perhaps turned around. They had a turntable there, so that's where MTD was. If you took a bridge over University Avenue at that point, it's much less dangerous than if you do it at University Avenue and Lincoln Avenue. So if you're going to Danville and you're looking at Broadway, you're looking at the station theater, you're looking at a railroad, which is still active, going to Overvine into the yards and storage yards that are still active. So I wanted to remind the Natural Area Study Group that there's an opportunity to put a rail trail adjacent to a railroad line. That's if the railroads were prepared to go along with that. Well, it may take 15 years to work out, but it's a possibility. You could even have a bicycle bridge that would go over University Avenue without you necessarily crossing University Avenue. But at that point, it's not got the complexity of Lincoln and University and a railroad line. If you were in Europe, perhaps you could have lights, and the bicycles would have permission to go first. And then that's not really possible here because the general traveling public hardly recognizes a bicycle, let alone waiting for a bicycle, and it's fairly low traffic bicycle to go through. So what I'm suggesting there is that be a parallel corridor, a bridge over University and Lincoln. So now when the Natural Area Study Group is going out onto University and then through to 150, you pass MTD. Now, once you get on in 150, basically 150 parallels the abandoned railroad bed. I want people to look at that because it's not the easiest to understand. The railroad yards, whether it be in Danville or in Bantam, when they close out, they keep a pigtail of 1 mile long so that a 1 mile freight train can back up on that mile and then channel freight cars into, or passenger cars too, for that matter, into yards, freight yards with different connections. So in the past, you would have selected perhaps 10 different lines. You would select different lines to coordinate and bring together a manifest train that was going in one direction and another yard for a manifest train in another direction. That 1 mile pigtail has been cut by a Smith's Road. So I wanted the Natural Area Study Group to know about Smith's Road. It leaves the 1 mile of pigtail cut in half, and the second half is no longer used. The rails are still there in the bushes. The trees have grown around, but at the end of Smith's Road, it's a very short little road, a couple of 100 yards at the most, and it runs into Weaver Park. And at Weaver Park, the Urbana Park District's put together a headquarters, head for the trail. The head is not really, the trail is not finishing there. The trail finishes at Main Street, and at Main Street, about a half a mile, perhaps even a mile of it, runs to Weaver Park. And Weaver Park has trees that are historic, and it has prairie that's recreated, and it's in honor of Mr. Weaver, who is has been a political person in his time and very well known to the public. So I want the Natural Area Study Group to look along Smith Street, you know where the head is, but also know that it's very dangerous to come from the real head of the finishing of the Kickabout Trail at Main Street and 150, and that there's not a wide possibility of having a safe bicycle and hike trail to Weaver Park. My alternative is to continue the rail bed. The Forest Preserve, which is now in charge of the Kickapoo Trail in Champaign County and Vermilion County, it's Vermilion County Conservation District. The Forest Preserve still owns a half mile that connects with that Smith Road pigtail that's not used. I would like to see that railroad bed extended into and around the Norfolk Southern yards and to go through the MTD yards that connect and across Springfield, across University Avenue to Ambax Park, to the sanitary treatment plant, to a little bit of Park District that's owned, Havana Park District is owned on the south side of the Boneyard, across to Kerr Township, where the Keir Road, where the Havana Park District has a physical plant and offices. Then go west to Broadway and up Broadway and around Anita Purvis Center and around Busey Woods and back into Bradley, along Bradley and along enough to then take a side road down to Pravina. So you have to know that this imaginary bridge, which may never happen, but it is the sort of thing you have to think about. Considering coming across Bradley Avenue, going down south to the bridge, it's an imaginary bridge over University and Lincoln, onto the rail bed, which could have an adjacent trail. That could go west gradually to its Norfolk Southern line. The trail would be adjacent to Washington. And underneath Washington, you can go underneath Canadian National, come out on the other side and use a retired piece of Wabash Railroad line to get to a venue in Champaign. We figure that that would be rather helpful, rather direct, and rather safe. It would take probably about $4 million to put a high-rise bicycle bridge across University Avenue and Lincoln. But I think it would be worthwhile. It would give a direct connection to Champaign. It's also north of the university and could have several roads that run south to the university. So there's connectivity there. One of the problems we have is that if we have a good portion of railroad bed that works well, and then there is an ugly portion, whether it's going north, as I've just described, or going south on Windsor Road or other places, we have to think about how to get this connection tidied up. Otherwise, the pieces that we're working on west of Champaign are not useful. So when I'm talking to the Natural Areas Study Group, which meets on Tuesdays at 9 o'clock for a season, I think the season's almost finished now, but the membership is there and the opportunity to do volunteer work is there and to get knowledge of these places. So my first portion of the trail guide to the Kickapoo was indeed the connectivity between the present end of the trail to Champaign. Not easy. It needs your attention. It would go in front of Carl Clinic. You'd almost have to start the trail going over a bridge there and come down behind Pravina and through to Champaign, remembering that there is still an active railroad line there that goes to the yards. At the same time, we have to think about the west side of Champaign, and that's another connection, but we dealt with that last week. So now I'm going to go back to Aldi's and Walmart and the trail, a functional trail to St. Joe finishes there because there's about a half mile to the actual end, which is a dangerous end where Main Street connects with 150. So many people start their trail at the Walmart end, where Walmart has provided a parking lot. And it is still on the toe of the Yankee Ridge Moraine. So there's a little bit of rolling territory there, and there's some interurban corridor that goes parallel. There's also urban housing that goes for about a mile. And so it's wide. It's wide for American disabilities activities. It's also higher because the ballast was capped with 8 inches of chip limestone to cap the possibility of creosote that leaked out of railroad ties. The rails were removed, the plates that the rails sat on were removed, the spikes were removed, and the rail bed was taken up, and stick rail taken to some other place where the rail will be welded together to provide functional rail where it's needed. Once you go past the urban extremes of East Urbana, you had a very low spot. It's called a chicken. It's a sort of lake that when you have a 5 or 10 inch rain, it fills with water, and was a block for 150 traffic. Some road widening was taken out of the Kickapoo right away, and so that reduced the amount of nature that's on either side. The interurban is still there, but often it's invaded some with farm work. That the interurban brought electricity and to these communities. In 1905, the early railroad came in probably in the late 50s, in 1850s. When electricity became a practical utility, whether it was direct current or alternating current. The direct current had to be boosted more often. The alternating current didn't have to be boosted so often, but along the corridor there were buildings, depots, usually in the same character. One very interesting one is at Fithian, where you can see where the power lines, the electrical power lines came in and went through the building, and there were motors or whatever to upgrade the power that was in those lines. The lines were called catenaries because, well, it's not because, but that's what they were called. They were overhead, and they connected with the train through a concertina, sometimes a pole, but it allowed the train to continue to progress. The interurban was a small train, 2 cars at the most, often only 1, and it was strictly an interurban between towns. It went parallel to the main line, which is more where you would want to go to St. Louis. You would get on that train and progress. So once you got to Cottonwood, that's where the bird bath was, where the low spot was. It was raised about 2 feet and is much improved. There's good prairie still there, but that's where early ecologists did a lot of their teaching and research just on the way to past Mayview Cemetery, which has history, which has, you can stand there and take a photograph with Fool's Memorial, and in the distance you can see Fool's Elevator. So if we go through Mayview to Fool's to a site where on the left-hand side, if you're going to Danville, is a grain seed production, Pioneer Grain. Right opposite, there's a little road that goes off to the right. And that one was where the railroad bed, the roads, and the interurban all went across the stream at a node where there would be less expansion, less erosion. If you the parts of a meandering stream that erode are the amplitudes of the wavelengths of a meandering stream, and so that road has been obsoleted. It's still there, and it still has its remnant prairie, but the road has been straightened, so it goes straight through St. Joe. People have a thing about straight. Jefferson wanted a plat that was straight, and it became national. And it's easier to know where your plot is if you have that sort of map to go by. I think we're getting towards the end of the time. I have more to say about this territory. I'm not lacking in thoughts about it, and I want you to be thinking about it. There are people who used this trail guide and went back and came and gave me some accolades for writing in the first place. It can be improved. People didn't exactly know where to get to Conky Town and things like that. So this has been Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And thank you to WEFT, and thank you to Urbana Public Television, both who helped this program into action, and had a wonderful celebration, 40th celebration for WEFT on Sunday, and lots of people who were early participants in putting this radio station together. Bye.